trying to get a holistic perspective here, give us all an opportunity to have a conversation. So it generally helps if I ask the first question, and that gives you a bit of time to start collecting your thoughts, and then we roll forward. So if I could ask Tony a question, I thought I could probably guess what he was going to say, but I was surprised when he said that higher taxes were the way to go. It seems to me, as someone who runs a business, that finding 3% worth of savings is something probably a lot of us have done over the last few years. Certainly the GFC gave my business a huge jolt. Is it really impossible for us to find 3% extra efficiency to make up that gap? Is it really necessary to go for higher taxes?
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Look, that's not raising taxes is not the first best option. There's obvious considerable scope for cutting expenditure, and it'd be interesting to see what the white paper comes out with this year, talking about the areas of overlap. So there is a need to cut spending. That's something I've said for a long time, but I think that in addition to that, the political constraints are such that there's going to have to be some increase in revenue as well. Particularly, and it doesn't have to be, it could be increases in some forms of revenue, but not necessarily a big increase in total revenue. It could be increases. My main advocacy was for GST, put more onto GST collection, and perhaps that could be offset with some relief on the income tax side. So I wouldn't like to be misinterpreted as flying the flag for higher taxation. It was not my message at all. But I think that it has to be part of the package, that the tax mix has to be changed, and GST is a state tax. I think a reason for increasing the GST is that people get to see that they're paying for something. I mean, there's a lot of people that think that everything's for free, and if you price it through an indirect tax, it's a signal to them that it's not free. So I think perhaps should have emphasised that the mix should be changed rather than the volume of tax. But I think politically the volume may have to change a shade.
Okay, well, I've had first dibs. I can keep asking questions. Gentleman up the back over here. Richard.
Richard Williams, a question for Larry. The 3 years the LNP government on the education side seemed to spend a lot of time reviewing things. Did you see any tangible progress made?
I think I think there are a number of issues inside your question. I think one of the first things is that as a result of reviews, what we tend to do is throw more money at education. And what I have noticed is we tend to throw more money so we can do even more of what hasn't worked in the past. I don't think the answers are about where to put increased funding. I think the answers are very much about how we do things. And in fact, I think we could do things a lot cheaper and have a lot better outcomes. In terms of the reviews that have gone on, the reviews have been very self-serving. They haven't actually been reviews that have given outcomes about strategy and direction. They have been reviews that have tried to give marks out of 10. And I don't think that that's very productive. I think what we need is reviews that actually give us strategy and direction, reviews that indicate to us how we can do things more effectively. But we also need to have governments with intestinal fortitude to take on the entrenched bureaucracies and be prepared to make changes. Most of our reviews have been how we can put more Band-Aids on the Band-Aids that are on top of Band-Aids. Very quick answer, Richard, but does that answer your question?
Another question?
Yeah, Paul Hislop. I've got a question for Larry as well. I've been interested in the debate going on about the quality of teachers, and we all focused on the standards at which we accept teachers in, but isn't the problem actually more one that we don't pay them enough and that we don't have differentiated payments? Economists look at this and think, look, essentially we've got a price cap, particularly in the public system and in the Catholic system. And so people who are deciding to be doctors or teachers figure that they can earn a lot more money being doctors. And while preferences come into account, they're going to go and be a doctor because they're going to earn a lot more money. So isn't that actually more the issue rather than just forcing standards to be high. If you force standards to be high, you'll have a shortage because not enough people will do the actual job.
I both agree and disagree with you. Let me start with the argument about you'll have less people to do the job. It's been my experience that high quality teachers aren't affected by an extra 2 or 3 or 4 students in their classes. High quality teachers deal with class size as part of day-to-day effort. What we are doing is decreasing class size to put band-aids on the problems we have poor teachers who can't cope with large numbers of students in their classes. You know, we heard during the election an announcement we're going to put on another 1,000 teachers. We heard yesterday that we're letting people into primary teaching at OP19. OP19 is pretty horrific. Now, where are the extra 1,000 teachers going to come from? You know, what we are doing is we are creating problems for ourselves by addressing the issues at the wrong end. Now, if we can set standards for teachers, we don't have to have such a paranoia about decreasing class size. We can actually free up a lot more money to pay the teachers the money that they deserve for the quality that they deliver. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of people here who went through school with class sizes of 30, 35, and you learnt because your teachers were very, very good. My son is currently a head of teaching and learning at a high school where people with 10 in the class can't get anything taught because it's just continual disruption because they don't know how to teach. My issue, I think, is that the money that you're talking about that is needed to pay teachers more is in fact being diverted to prop up teachers at the bottom end of the system. And if we actually set our standards and we drove our standards higher and we gave teachers the skills they need in classrooms. I mean, learning about constructivist ideology doesn't help you much when you've got a 15-year-old threatening to punch your lights out. We don't give them the skills they need. We should be giving them toolboxes. But the people we have training our classroom teachers are educational researchers and theorists. We should be having the people who have demonstrated they are highly effective classroom teachers training the teachers for that practical side and letting the researchers and the theorists do the professional development later in people's careers.
Sorry, there's a... Oh, just here. Sorry, gentleman here.
Yes, Paul Johnson's my name. Question for Ross. In the federal budget, when the concept of the medical fund was proposed, it seemed to be rejected by the medical profession, and there seemed to be a very adverse reaction from the GPs and everyone else. And then the media weighed in too, and of course the opposition, which appears to me the whole thing's just disappeared. And I got the general impression that the GPs particularly were extremely aggro about what the government was trying to do about the budgetary problems and the actual proposal. Would you like to comment on that?
I think your interpretation is correct. I think there's no doubt the profession was not going with the government on the concept of co-payments and then money going towards a research program. Sadly, though, the money going to a research program was ignored by the profession and the community, and the antagonism was more orientated to the administration of the co-payment and what that was going to do to the way they ran their practices. It was, I have to say, as a member of the profession, I thought the profession's behaviour and its reaction to the concept was narrow and confined to what was going to affect them rather than taking the bigger picture attitude to see what benefits there were in this proposition. If the whole thing was treated more calmly and there was then dialogue with government, I'm sure I'd like to think we could have had a better outcome. Whether that's still achievable or not, that's crystal ball gazing and I can't answer, but I hope it is, because as I've outlined, I think the concept of public money being confined for medical research is a great idea. How you raise the money is an issue that does need discussion. to get bogged down at this stage and who receives the money and what's the money going to be specifically used for is just a side issue. What we need to focus on is the concept of a future fund, public money in medical research. I think, though, in a short answer to your problem, I think your perception is right. I think the communication with the profession was found wanting and could have been done a lot better. Can we resurrect that as a community? Well, I hope so, because the concept is a very good one. And I think we all here tonight, I would all implore you all to consider what I've said about public money in medical research. The concept of money being spent without considering the potential financial benefit is the only way you're going to get appropriate research into antibiotics, as well as that appropriate research into the best way of administering and spending public money in the healthcare delivery system. Both things can be achieved in proper research, but we need the profession and then the community to come along with it, and that needs a lot more effort in communication.
There's someone just in behind here, I think. Yeah.
Yep.
Stephen.
My question is to the former Treasurer and the economist. It relates to this debt issue, which having young children worries me to hell. And I just want you to sort of expand a bit in your own thoughts of what the scenario is going to be. Clearly, you've got the idea of what you can do. You can sell assets, you get these efficiency drives, but both major political parties now seem to have abandoned that idea. But there comes a point where, you know, if we're a sovereign country, you'd bring in the IMF and they'd say, well, the politicians can't sort it out. Here's your economic plan. Let's put it into place and forget what the public does. You owe us the money, you've got to pay it back. It's a bit different because we're a state, but it comes to the point where we must be putting at risk our AAA rating as a country as Australia. We've got $300 billion economy here. We can't keep going indefinitely borrowing money, which seems to be what everybody seems to think they're going to do. And I guess a selfish question would be, with my young children, are we better to bolt to a AAA rated state and get away from the worst of it before it happens? Thank you.
Bringing deficits and debts under control is a massive challenge. I think, as I said earlier on, the most depressing aspect of it is that so much of the population, so much of the commentators don't accept that. So that's the first issue. Let's accept it as an issue. Then you talked about our children. It is. Fairness has become the debate in Australia, but how fair is it to have our children and grandchildren subsidising our standards of living today? I mean, that is the greatest fairness test, if you ask me. I keep harking on about, sure, the one way to bring a budget under control is to increase revenue, decrease expenditure. You can only increase revenue at the margins because very many increases will impact on growth. If people don't have the incentive to get out and earn and so forth, then you won't get the growth. And the other way you bring a budget under control is with economic growth. It solves so many problems. I know the federal budget is such, and I've heard Hockey say it, that growth itself won't solve it, and I think that's probably true. But you know, in the 10 years of the resources, so-called Millennium Resources boom, federal government revenue increased from 175 billion in 2002-3, 175 billion to 376 billion. By $200 billion, and that was mostly through growth. So you've got to get growth. So everything has got to be focused on, yes, bringing spending under control, but stimulating growth. And stimulating growth, some people do that the wrong way. The best way you can get growth is to get out of the way and make it easy for people to invest and do the things they want to do to earn money. And you've got to look at your regulations. You've got a free, open, flexible economy, and you will get that growth in a country like Australia that is so well positioned close to Asia with all of those sorts of benefits coming now that we haven't had for 100 years. It'll grow its way out of problems so long as people understand that.
Well, entirely agree with what Keith's just said there. And I'm still a little bit concerned that Graham's painted me as a high tax person. No, not at all. Just the practicality of it, I think. We've seen with the recent election results that people just will not take cutbacks in spending, which is unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. So if you've got this problem of debt, there's going to have to be the mix of the cutting spending, which would be my first preference, and to somehow overcome this misperception that cutting spending is bad for growth. Keith mentioned that we've got to get growth going. Obviously, that is a part of the solution. If you're increasing your GDP, you're increasing the denominator in that debt to GDP ratio, so you can bring the relative size of debt down. And I think it's just a gross misperception that's pushed by the Federal Treasury that if we cut back spending, we're going to reduce growth in the economy. You can increase growth by cutting back spending. If you cut back unproductive spending, you can increase saving. Saving can lead to more investment. It puts downward pressure on interest rates, puts downward pressure on the exchange rate. The exchange rate improves competitiveness. You increase net export. So cutting bad spending is a means to higher growth, and that message just completely gets lost on the Federal Treasury. And I think, unfortunately, we've had people in place during the early years of the present federal government that were there advocating the increased spending in the first place. So they're very loath to say, well, let's cut it back, because they've justified the increased spending as saving Australia from recession, which I've shown demonstrably is not true. Yes, cutting spending is the first and best option. It's just that it's very hard, and the debt problem is there, and I think ultimately and realistically it's going to have to be a combination of the spending cuts and some revenue changes.
Can I just make one point on the way through about, and that relates to health and the research fund. I agree with you about a research fund, but it was poorly sold in the federal budget in the sense that we were talking about a crisis, a budget crisis, a budget repair task, and the co-payment was part of overcoming that crisis. And then all of a sudden, all of that went into a fund, which did nothing to repair the budget. So it should have been separate altogether from that, because it just confused the narrative and made it very difficult in the end to sell anything at all.
If I could just ask Tony a follow-up question. In terms of spending and efficiency, how does Queensland rate against the other Australian states? Like, are we above average in terms of efficiency of spending in the public service, or below average?
Well, the Commission of Audit lays all that out very clearly and shows that Queensland was spending far more in terms of public service growth over the decade prior to the Commission of Audit, which was written in 2011. There was a 40% increase, for instance, in public service numbers. There was a 9.5% sort of average salary growth, which was above the national average at state level. There was big increases in infrastructure spending. The water grid cost $9 billion. There was a lot of spending going on, and through the GFC, things just went haywire as well. So excessive spending was the key cause of the problem we find ourselves in today.
Okay, I'm not quite in control of this process. The man with the mic actually is. I think I saw Dan up the back first, and then I've seen Amanda down a bit of chivalry. Amanda, you're on.
My question's for Larry. You mentioned that there's a problem with a body of underperforming teachers effectively being a protected species and not being taken out of the system and replaced by more competent teachers. The other side of the story I hear is that there are high-performing, intelligent graduates in teaching who just can't get a job. The example I give is that there's an education faculty in regional Queensland that had 2 students from an entire graduating year get a job. How do we make administrative change in order to make sure that that new potential is getting its opportunities?
Yeah. most of your initial take-up of new teachers is the Department of Education. And the Department of Education has now put that placement and selection process in the hands of the individual schools. And there are some real problems because individual schools are making some pretty strange sort of decision-making processes about who they take on and why they take them on. I'm well aware of a number of schools who are claiming that they can't fill all of their teacher vacancies. And yet there are a pool of teachers that they're not going to. They're waiting for people to come to them. I think with most issues to do with public provision of education, the problem is that people are waiting to be told what to do in the schools. We have had an initiative in the last couple of years, the Independent Public Schools, which I think has a lot of potential and has the potential to actually allow those schools to actively seek the best teachers they can and to offer them the incentives they need to go to rural areas or some of the more difficult socioeconomic areas of Brisbane. But again, we put that initiative in place on the basis if it's a good idea, we'll put it in place Monday. And if you are going to run an independent public school, which has control over now a multi-million-dollar budget and control over all of the HR and the IR and all of the marketing and all of those sort of things, you can't expect principals and teachers who are trained to be nothing else but teachers to know how to run that business side of their enterprise. And even in those situations where I think there's a huge amount of potential to really allow that competitive market to get the best teachers into your school, one of the problems is that the people don't know how to go about the business process to do those things properly. They're taking on board a couple of really good initiatives and they're really happy they're doing that, but in doing that, they're running it with a great deal of inefficiency. We needed to think through the strategy, prepare people for the change, and in so doing, give them the capacity to actually seek out the best employees. In the private sector actively markets to get the best teachers it can for the areas it can. Our public sector hasn't been given the same capacity, not because they don't have high-level leaders and high-level teachers, but because they haven't had the backup of the department in terms of strategy and processes to allow those things to happen well. I know I sort of skirted your issue a little bit, and part of the answer is I really don't know why it is that a school will take on, in some cases, a teacher who has very little demonstration of good teaching skills, while another 3 or 4 in the same area won't be taken on. That happens, and I can't answer that. But I think the general issue about the competitive market needing to be driven by people who understand how to operate it and giving our public school principals and deputies the skills they need to do that is a very important issue, particularly in the move to independent public schools.
Thanks, Larry. Question up the back, Dan.
This is a question for Dr. Cardwell. Sorry, we haven't met before. So probably the most famous Australian medical researcher, Dr. Howard Florey, the guy who invented penicillin, his research was not widely appreciated. It was actually privately funded. So probably the antibiotic that had more of an impact on world health to that time was created by an Australian his research was privately funded. So I'm very sceptical about the idea that simply throwing public money, and the more public money we throw at a particular industry, will automatically lead to a better result. I mean, we threw so much money at the NBN, and it was such a, I read today that it's going to cost, at least $4,000 per household to connect each house. There's a tendency in Australia to think that, a new technology or new thing coming down the line, the way to get ahead of the pack is to throw a massive amount of taxpayers' money at it, while not appreciating that it's in those really dynamic sectors, the state is so far off the cutting edge that that what throwing public money in many cases crowds out research or actually acts as an inhibitor to real innovation rather than one that facilitates it. Welcome your comments.
Okay, well, I'm happy to talk to you privately afterwards, but let me just answer that by saying we currently in this country spend 0.05% of our GDP on medical research. We are at about the OECD average. We're way behind other countries. And I look to research, medical research globally, most of it, tragically, I think from an Australian point of view, comes out of USA and Europe. But we actually have made great achievements for the small amount of money we put into it. The papillovirus for cervical cancer is a good example. Cochlear implants is another. CPAP machines for sleep apnea is an Australian invention. We've managed it with small funds, but we are not going to continue to contribute globally to medical research unless we're prepared to put more into it. And we could argue it, but in my view, we currently have paid far too little attention to it, and we should appreciate my final comment when I was speaking, is that there are jobs and there are businesses to be developed through medical research. We are already exporting some of our technology. We could do a lot better. But businessmen tell me, and we can verify or deny, but business expansion can only be done with research. But why I put the plea for public funding is that some of it has to be orientated to the non-profit sector. You won't get the development, and I'll use antibiotics as a great example of that. That just won't happen unless it is done with non-profit in mind, because there will be no profit in it, but there'll be huge benefits for the community globally and certainly Australians.
Keith just wanted to add something to that.
I don't know a lot about health research, but I do know a bit about other kind of research. And what is becoming obvious to me and others now with research in Australia, and particularly government-funded research, and that's universities and government departments, is that there's so much research and so much IP sitting on the shelves in Australia worth billions and billions of dollars. It's never been commercialised. And there's something wrong with the incentive system that researchers, they've done their job when they've done the research, they've had it published, they've had it peer-reviewed, they're finished. So it sits on the shelf. It's the end process of commercialising it, patenting it, selling it, getting it out there. There is I know some that I've come across recently, it's just mind-boggling. And it's just sitting there doing nothing. So that's one of the problems with public research. We need to change somehow the incentive game so that the real incentive is to get that research out there really doing something, commercialise it to the benefit of the whole of Australia. And you are right, that research and innovation is fundamental to our growth as a country.
I think there was a question down here, and then... No, one in the front row here. We did promise you around about a 7:30 finish. The speakers ran over about 10 or 15 minutes. So I'm sort of in your hands. I was somewhere around about now going to call last question, but if you're happy to go on a bit further, we can. Or we can have the last question now, and then Gary Johns can sort of run through a summary of what's been said, and we can all go and get something to... And he'll be a couple of hours. So do you want to take just one more question or a few more questions? Can I just get an indication? Doc, do you mind if we... Wendy? Yeah. We can't hear you. You're whispering.
Sorry. It's to Mr. de Lacy. You indicated that our budgetary woes may be resolved with growth. Would you be able to comment, please, on your integrated agricultural project up on the Flinders River and give us an overview of that?
Sorry, comment on what?
On your integrated agricultural project on the Flinders River.
It's not really the Flinders River, it's the Gilbert River system.
Sorry, the Gilbert River. And secondly, the Water Reform Act. Why is it pilloried so much?
Well, the answer to your second question is because this is a great issue for the Greens. You know, they see water and people using water, and that is the so fundamental to the environment. And they base a lot of it on the Murray-Darling. You know, we have over-allocated the water from the Murray-Darling system over the years, and it's had substantial environmental impacts. So it is now, you know, the Save the World people have taken this on as a very big issue. But the Water Act has got nothing to do with that. It is all about sustainability and what have you. I mean, the water we're looking for in our project is just 10% of the average flow of the Gilbert River system. There is a rule of thumb in Australia that says a third you can harvest, 2/3 for the environment. We're talking 10% and 90%. So it's not really an issue. But it's just one of those things that is very heavy in the environmental movement and resonates in the leafy suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne and places like that. You know, we're destroying our water and we're a dry country and we shouldn't be just giving it away and what have you. In terms of our project, I haven't really got the time to go into that. It's a very big project, but the reason it works is because there is water and it's integrated. We would have the water storage, we would have the farming, and we would do all of the processing. So it would all be integrated, and then in the processing, the waste from one processing becomes the feedstock for the next one, so that everything is ultimately used. But it's totally sustainable. We create all of our own electricity. We actually export renewable electricity into the grid because in the tropics you can grow so much biomass, which is really only stored energy. So it ticks every box, and yet there are people opposing that. It's just simply too big. I mean, there's a lot of people out there that think that a backyard garden is too big. Obviously, if you get into 65,000 hectares of irrigated cropping, it's a bit too big for some people to conceive. But there's a lot bigger story behind it than that.
Okay. So, Greg.
Greg Windsor. Keith, along those lines, I was thinking more about the new money for the Queensland economy and from agriculture. And obviously this project you're progressing or would like to progress represents a fairly substantial increase in investment and outcomes for agriculture. We hear about the age and uptake of food and the appetite for Western foods and the increasing volumes. Just want to get your thoughts about, do you think Queensland can make up some of the mining royalties through improved agricultural production in Queensland?
Well, you'd expect me to say yes. There's 3 or 4 of these projects up in the north. There's something like 90 million megalitres of water flows into the Gulf of Carpentaria. The whole of the Murray-Darling system is about 30 million megalitres. And of course that drains New South Wales, Victoria and half of Queensland. So it's up there and the land is available and what have you, but you need to have those fundamentals. It needs to be done on scale. You can't have an agricultural project in isolated regions and do it small because you've got to have processing on site. So you've got to have the economies of scale that will justify the processing and a whole range of other things. But I believe, yes, and it's the most sustainable industry in the world. Unlike an extractive industry, these go on forever. So I think there's great opportunity, but governments need to assist through the regulatory phase and creating an environment that we can do. We're not asking for a single cent. The private sector has got to do, including all the water storage. Private sector does it all, but you need governments to create an environment where it works.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, look, I'll take one more. But that's it. Definitely the last.
Darryl Campbell, this is a question for Keith. Keith, how the hell do we get out of this mess, given the political system that we now have, where it seems that the norm is that government's tossed out after 3 years because they haven't provided what the people expected them to provide during that period? Now, on a 3-year cycle, and this mob are going to change and take away a lot of the things that have been put in over the last 3 years, and if the LNP get back in 3 years' time, they'll change it back again. But in the meantime, we've still got this massive structural deficit, and you've got the same thing federally and in the other states.
Sorry, I can't answer that one. I just don't know. It is very depressing about the attitudes, but I've said that half a dozen times tonight, and I don't know what the answer is. I would like to fall back to the old theory that good policy is good politics. Doesn't even seem to be the case anymore. I'd like somebody to try it a bit more, explain it better, develop the narrative, and just keep telling people what it is. I don't think the federal government sold their strategy very well. I thought their narrative got mixed up. That PPL was just awful, the paid parental leave. You know, it's totally inconsistent with the rest of the message. You've got to have a message without any of those distractions in it. Maybe somebody can do it, but I'm as depressed as you are.
Okay, thanks very much, Keith. Gary, we allocated 10 minutes for you to sum up, but you're only going to need 2. That's great. Okay, we believe in the market, and we also believe in efficiency, and this is a demonstration of just how efficient you can get.
Good, thank you. Really, it's an opportunity to thank Graham for his great organisation, and to Rod Snyder. This is a good little meeting, directly after a bombshell of an election. We have an accidental premier and an accidental government. I just wish we had a recall provision in the Queensland Constitution, because by the time this government hands down its first budget, we will all realise there's been a gross mistake that has been made, because I don't think they'll be able to form a budget. I just think they have no idea what they're doing or how it is that they will face the sorts of debt and deficit problems that our speakers have outlined today. So, barring a recall provision, I would suggest you all join the Institute for Progress, and that we shall form a provisional government for a short period until we eventually take over with better ideas. Thank you for coming. Join us for dinner and more conversation. Thank you. Thank our speakers.
So I'd now like to ask Amanda Stoker to move a vote of thanks to the speakers. But before I do that, I should just acknowledge a few people in the room who are associated with us. At the back, a man who's very interested in the private sector but not the government paying for research, Dan Ryan, who's a director. Thanks to Rod, who's our sort of director of events and who's been ferrying the microphone around and manning the table. Down here, probably most important person is our chair, Bob Tucker. And Amanda, yep, sorry, stand up, Bob. Amanda is about to introduce herself. Gary and I were sort of co-conspirators in starting this in the first place. We had the idea of taking over the Brisbane Institute when it went bust, but that didn't eventuate, so we found another way. There's also a number of people who are supporters and members of the AIP in this room. There's membership forms at the back. It can be very cheap or very expensive, but even at the expensive end it's very cheap, because the good things we're going to do for Queensland are going to make you all a lot richer, both in your wallets but also in your spirits and in culture, because we're not just about the economy, as you can gather by the range of speakers that we've got here. And I'd also like to thank Ida Merck. She's travelled further than anyone else to get here. She's from Sweden originally, but she's studying at Griffith University and just volunteered the other day to come in and do some work. And this is her 3rd day helping out, so she's really come into the deep end. I haven't missed anyone, have I? It's the perils of doing this sort of thing. No. Okay, if I have, you... Good, well, we'll note that. So, Amanda, you can clean up for me if I've missed anyone. And I
hope you're all getting ready for your jobs in the provisional government. think we're going to need it. Look, I think it's fair to say tonight that our panellists and probably many of us in this room have agreed that as a state we face some significant economic problems such that we're fast approaching the cliff that Keith so aptly described. It also seems to be common ground that, as Tony has said, changing our path requires both political will and an informed electorate who are willing to countenance change. And yet, we've just gone through one hell of a state election which can only have sent politicians of all persuasions the message that if you try and confront difficult decisions to implement change, you will be punished. And yet, if we look at the challenges identified by Larry and Ross, we can only deal with those if there is a real change in economic policy, and quickly. There's a role for you, for me, and for the AIP in helping to generate the change in community and public thinking that's needed for the bigger picture to take a much healthier shape. Can I ask you now to thank our eminent panellists for their time, their expertise and their ideas tonight. We have some little gifts that will be passed out in just a moment, but can I finish with this? There's a great deal of intelligence in this room. Can I call on each of you to use it to generate the expansion in public thinking that is needed to be able to properly prepare for our future? As the AIP says, it won't look after itself. And can I suggest, be so bold as to do so, that continuing your support of and your involvement in the AIP is a most worthwhile way for you to make that investment. Thank you to all for your participation tonight.